Hello, my name is Ian Brown. This is week 5. And on week 5, we are going to be discussing an article called Colonization, Education, and Indigenous People. And in this article, which was written by Leona Pahama and Jenny Lee Morgan, who are both Maori scholars based in Aotearoa, which is also called New Zealand, and they will be kind of discussing this idea, getting into colonization and education, especially when it comes to Indigenous people. Mainly based in Aotearoa, but they have examples from all over the world. My interviewee is my partner, Sarah Falavolita, and I interviewed her in the first week of class, and now she's interviewing me for this week. So first off, thank you, Sarah, for this question. It's a very foundational question in the readings this week. And I would start off by saying, definitely there's a Trojan horse within the pedagogies and curriculum on immigrant, refugees, just all people within Canada, seeing that all of us are immigrants. I say the first part is comparison, and the comparison curriculum pedagogies of the education system is really based on the whole premise of like civilizing and civility, and how the colonial really focus on how they're able to even push forth like the mandate of education or targeting and using it as a tool is based on civilizing. And that's really having a norm or a port of reference, which at this point in time, or at that point in time, is the colonial masters, which was Europe. And with that, comparing everything based on that, outside of that would be considered uncivilized or savages. And you see that now, even when it comes to standardization and testing curriculum, it's really based on a premise of this is the point of reference and this is normal, whether it be the colonial idea of normal or globalization's ideal of normal, and everything is based on that baseline. So we're failing in math because we're not to that baseline, or failing in English if we're not to that baseline. And that really stirs on this whole ideology of comparison, which I feel like is one of the ways that the current pedagogies and curriculum align with colonization today. When it comes to the idea, when immigrant or refugee students come into the classroom, they are seen, as one of the past writers this course alluded to, as empty vessels and ready to be poured into by the teachers, and ready to be educated, really civilized by the teachers. There's not a real recognition of innate literacies and education that they already bring to the table. The words of the author of Pahama and Lee Morgan, destroying the legitimacy that they already have innate education or innate literacies. And in regards to the Maori people, it was tactile literacies, visual literacies, reading waves, current winds, epistemologies, and their ontology. Migration patterns, understanding celestial bodies, their education was all about. That was their English and calculus and math and social sciences. And that's the notion that they had something to bring to the table. But the colonial mindset is that they didn't have anything to bring to the table. And sometimes that's what happens in the education system here. The last point on this question I want to cover is language. Language is a key component and a clear example of a Trojan horse. The Kenyan scholar Ngugi Wa work, the decolonized mind, speaks about the role of language, and the purpose of language in a colony is to reshape the way people understand the relationship with themselves, relationship to their nation, to empire, and to the material conditions of production. I'm going to give you an example that I kind of see the use of language and English reshape the way people understand the relationship with themselves. My daughter came home one day and she was talking about how she had a conversation with her teacher, and she told her teacher that patois, which is a Jamaican dialect and language, or Creole, was a language she thought, my daughter thought. And her teacher was quick to say that English, those are really just derivatives of English and they're not real languages. And it was interesting that kind of really shifted the way she kind of thought about herself and her language. We had a further discussion about someone named Miss Louise Bennett, which we call her Miss Lou in the Jamaican tradition. And Miss Louise Bennett was really someone who took back and legitimized the language of patois for West Indians and Jamaicans. And I just wanted to read something from something that kind of so from a book about her, and it says, though Jamaica's official language is English, the mother tongue of most Jamaicans is Jamaican Creole, or commonly known to as patois, which combines structures of English and Africa. And when Louise Bennett began writing and performing in the 1930s, the vernacular she employed was usually called dialect patois or patois. She was resistant by some who claimed to regret a departure from proper English, and approved by many who enjoyed the humor that founded in her language, authentic. I just wanted to, that kind of beckons into Watiango's work, because he only speaks or writes firstly in Kikuyu, which is his native tongue, and then he translates into English, just a way to take back and decolonize the idea of language, seeing that it's one of the Trojan horses of education's curriculum pedagogies. In my school career, I was never really taught of Canada's true colonial history, or in a critical review of Canada's colonial history. I was taught about white settlers' ambition, exploration, and survival. I was taught about fur traders and farmers, and a native population that received them in open arms, but also a native population or indigenous population that did not develop the natural resources that were already here. And that was something that the settlers came, and because of their tenacity were able to develop industries out of the natural resources that were already here. So also, these things were not taught to me in a critical way. There was no mention of racism in the colonial history that we reviewed, or the white civilized dispossessing people of their land who were not whites and who were non-civilized, quote unquote. There is no mention of settler colonization and this idea of whiteness coming into a space and creating the term property and taking things as their property and taking spaces and environments as their property. So what I learned is really Professor Morgan would call myth taker approach to history. And that was a history that really, what the main point of it was to deliberately concoct falsehoods to justify a process that actually was unjustifiable. The colonization of Canada, mainly a lot of unjustifiable acts, or many unjustifiable acts, but there's these whole falsehoods that were concocted, and that was fed to me during my education experience. So this myth-taker approach to the colonial history that Canada has continues to propagate itself today. And like Sarah says, it's prevalent today. Even the Canadian national anthem, it's sang, and the notion behind it is that there's one nation, and that nation is Canada. But we know, when we pay attention and just the readings that we've done this semester so far, we know that there's many nations within Canada. So the idea that there's one Canadian national anthem is preposterous in just that approach, because we're not even identifying the nations and that are sovereign within Canada. But on top of that, one thing that I want to really focus on in regards to this answer is when we think about the segmentation of careers for young people and for students. So careers, the way that it's seen, is in your career, you only have a few career options, and you're told that your career is your identity. People ask you your name, then ask you, what do you do? And people ask you, So what do you do? And with that, you need to settle on something. Guidance counselors force you to really settle on something. If we took a step back a little bit and paid attention to how the indigenous ideology, when it comes to your purpose, it's very different. It's very much based on when you're born, certain giftings that you have, certain things that you give back to your local community, and the different parts of who you are and who you represent are all valid. Not just because you make money in this avenue, but you're a mother, or you're a teacher, or you're a caregiver, a provider, or a guide in another sense, doesn't discount or make those things less than. If student teachers and teacher students can learn and understand and have a foundation of what colonization is and what it does, and what it's still doing, and how it's prevalent within the education system, I think that's a way that they can approach education and decolonization frame of mind. Decolonization is all about the rematuration of indigenous peoples to their land and to their way of life, and imbuing the indigenous way of life and indigenous education into the school system in general. We talk about that in the second piece, but understanding what happened, the truth and reconciliation stories I think will be great to influence the understanding of what colonization really was about. And having a clear understanding of the Trojan horse of language. I think language has the power to reinforce colonial ideologies, and our literacy is very written, and the forms of indigenous literacies is more in the context of storytelling, in music. There's a whole bunch of legitimate literacies that can be a part of the literacy that is already there. That is like the main component of education now. So challenging the main literacies that are there and having them being influenced and added on when it comes to indigenous literacies. I remember my wife talking about anti-racism workshop she was a part of, and the facilitator said that we clap in this class when we ask hard questions. And I think the second part of Sarah's question, where she asked, can we deconstruct the ways in which education has systemically been employed as a vehicle for espousing ideals conducive to the dominant culture, and disallow education to be wielded as a form of political power, kind of lends to we clap when we ask these hard questions. And I say that because Professor Bob Morgan's book, Beyond the Guest Paradigm, I think that's foundational in how we approach this question, because the guest paradigm, it characterizes the current Aboriginal education policies and programs, and utilizes principles of Aboriginal self-determination and cultural survival and affirmation when you challenge or to challenge assimilation and cultural contamination of influences of Eurocentric education on Aboriginal cultures, values, traditions, and knowledge systems. So let's put this into the context of an example. You're in a classroom and the teacher is speaking about the criminal justice system, and the colonial ideologies is that you need to have prisons, that they're punitive and to reform people, and they're a must. But when you back up and think about the indigenous experience, indigenous histories, there's people like the Maori people that didn't have prisons. So there's another form and a rebuttal to that colonial ideology. And that conversation is something that's affirmed. That conversation is something that is wanted and is desired in a classroom setting, and not something that you outcast a student for, or that you remove the idea that they're an ideal student because they're challenging these colonial ideologies and notions that are brought up. So that's a way that I think that the guest paradigm can be very important in this conversation, Sarah. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for those questions. They're really critical, really engaging, and push my thinking forward. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. And again, my name is Ian Brown. This is week 5, and our conversation is about colonization, education, and indigenous people. That article was written by Leonie Bahama and Jenny Lee Morgan. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for listening.